to find a basis for row space of this matrix A, which is a square matrix of 4 by 4 type. That is, number of rows and columns are equal to 4. Before finding the basis for this matrix A should be first converted into the row echelon form, right? For that, we need to make the leading entry of every non-zero row to be 1, right? Okay, here for the first row, I'm already having 1 over here, but this 1 will be the leading entry if all other entries of this first column should be 0, right? Likewise, for the second row, we need to make this as 1, that is the leading entry, if we are able to make all other entries to be 0, right? So that is how we get the row echelon form, right? Okay. I'm having this matrix A over here. So I need to make this as a leading entry. For that, I need to make 2, 3, 1, all these entries to be 0. For that, we are going to apply some row operations. So how can I make this 2 as 0? If I multiply the elements of the first row with -2 and then adding this result to the elements of the second row, then I get this 2 to be as 0, right? So I need to change the second row, right? Okay, I need to change the second row by adding the elements of the first row, but the elements of the first row should be multiplied with -2. This 2 and 1 is representing the row number. And the row you need to change is first to be mentioned at the first place, because I need to change the row 2, so writing here R2 first. Multiplying the first element of the row 1 with -2 and then adding this to the element of the second row. So I'm going to change the second row. So writing first row as it is first. So multiplying 1 with -2 we get -2 and adding this to 2 we get 0. Multiplying 2 with -2 we get -4 and adding this to 3 we get -1. Multiplying 3 with -2 we get -6 and adding this to 5 we get -1. Multiplying 5 with -2 we get -10 and adding this to 8 we get -2. So I get the 2 as 0, right? Okay, to make 3 as 0 now, the next one. So for that, I need to change the elements of the third row now, right? So the next operation is changing the row third and adding the elements of the row third with the elements of the row 1, but elements of the row 1 are first multiplied with -3. So now multiplying the first row with -3. 1 is multiplied with -3 and adding with this 3 we get 0. Multiplying 2 with -3 we get -6 and adding this to 4 we get -2. Multiplying 3 with -3 we get -9 and adding this to 7 we get -2. Multiplying 5 with -3 we get -15 and adding this to 11 we get -4. And now to make this element to be 0, for that we need to multiply the first row with now -1. So I need to change the elements of the fourth row now. So applying the operation as changing the row 4 and adding the elements of the row 4 to the elements of the row 1, but row 1 should be multiplied with -1 first. So multiplying 1 with -1 we get -1 and adding this to 1 we get 0. 2 is multiplied with -1 getting -2 and adding this to 1 we get -1. 3 is multiplied with -1 we get -3 and adding this to 2 we get -1. 5 is multiplied with -1 we get -5 and adding this to 3 we get -2. Very fine. So we get all the elements to be as 0, 0, 0. So this first element now becomes our leading element for the row 1. Now for the second row, I need to make this to be a leading element, and that leading element should be 1, or the leading entry should be 1. And I'm already having 1 over here, but there is negative sign also. Just we need to multiply the second row with minus 1. We are going to change the row 2 by multiplying the elements of the row 2 with minus 1. So multiplying the elements of the second row with minus 1, we get 0, 1, 1 and 2, right? And rest of the elements as 0, minus 2, minus 2, minus 4, 0, minus 1, minus 1, minus 2. So we are getting 1 now over here, right? To make this a leading entry, all other entries should be 0. Just multiplying the elements of the row 2 with negative 2 and adding this to the elements of the row 1. So we are going to change the row 1, but row 2 should be multiplied with minus 2 first. Okay. Multiplying 0 with minus 2 and adding this to the element of the first row, we get 0 plus 1 as 1 only, right? No change. Multiplying 1 with minus 2, we get minus 2, and adding this to 2, we get 0. Multiplying 1 with minus 2, we get minus 2, and adding this to 3, we get 1. Multiplying 2 with minus 2, we get minus 4, and adding this to 5, we get 1. And here are the rest of the elements. Now required to make this 2 as 0. For that, we need to change the row 3 and adding the elements of the row 3 with the elements of the row 2. But the elements of the row 2 should be multiplied with, yes. So multiplying the elements of the second row with 2 only. Multiplying 0 with 2, we get 0, and adding this to 0, we get 0. There is no change. Please remember, we are changing the elements of the row 3, right? Okay. Multiplying the second element of row 2 with 2, we get 2. And adding this to minus 2, we get 0. Multiplying 1 with 2, we get 2. And adding this to minus 2, we get 0. Multiplying 2 with 2, we get 4. And adding this to minus 4, we get 0. Required to make this to be as now 0, so that this one becomes your leading entry. So now I need to change this row 4. The required row operation is, okay, changing the elements of the row 4 and adding the elements of the row 4 with the elements of the row 2, but the elements of the row 2 should be multiplied with, yes, should be multiplied with 1 only, right? Because if I multiply this 1 with 1, I get 1, and 1 is added to minus 1, we get 0. Multiplying this 1 with 1, we get 1, and adding this to minus 1, we get 0. Multiplying this 2 with 1, we get 2, and adding this to minus 2, we get 0. So now, this is the leading entry because all other entries are 0 now. It is not necessary that you have to follow these row operations. You can apply your own row operations also, right? Okay. So now I'm having only these two rows to be as non-zero, and rest of the rows are 0, 0, 0, 0. Rest of the rows are 0. So there is no need to get the leading entry for the third row because all the elements of the third row are 0. And all the elements of the fourth row are also 0. So we get only two non-zero rows, which forms the basis for row space of A, because this is now your row echelon form, right? So writing the basis for this matrix, which is your A matrix. So the bases are 1, 0, 1, 1, the first row, and the second row, that is 0, 1, 1, 2. These are the bases for row space of A, and the dimension for RA is, how many bases are there? 2 bases, this and this. So the dimension of row space of A is 2, right? Okay, thank you.